Hi all, I'm Jessica Grannis with the Georgetown Climate Center, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background about our work at the center generally, and then some of my specific research and work with states and communities on coastal resilience. If I can figure out how to use the clicker. There we go. So the Georgetown Climate Center is a center based out of the law school at Georgetown. We were created in the run-up to comprehensive climate legislation on the Hill to provide a voice for states in that dialogue and to help the states interact with the federal agencies and federal policymakers designing that legislation to make sure that all of the good work and innovation that the states had already done on the topic of reducing emissions and preparing for impacts was informing the legislation on the Hill and protecting their rights to continue to innovate and work in this space. We work both on helping states and communities reduce their emissions, their greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector as well as the transportation sector. And then we also work with states and communities to help them prepare for the impacts of climate change, because we've put enough emissions into the atmosphere already. We are inevitably going to see impacts from climate change, and communities are already beginning to see those impacts. So in my side of the house, the adaptation side, we work with states and communities to help them prepare for those impacts. So we've already seen a range of impacts along our coastal communities. We've seen a foot of sea level rise over the last century on average across most of our coasts. And though that impact of sea level rise is exacerbated in these extreme situations, like we're being threatened with it where I'm from in DC this weekend with hurricanes that take storm surges and drown communities, damage infrastructure, and destroy the natural resources that provide natural storm buffers. And with increased projections for sea level rise over the next century, these are the projections from the National Climate Assessment that was released a couple years ago. We are here, and you can see that under a high scenario, we're looking at an additional 6 to 7 feet of sea level rise, and under a low scenario, which is just a baseline extension, we're looking at 0.7 feet. And so most states or communities are planning for those intermediate levels of sea level rise. But if you're a state or community, you can imagine what that range of prediction means for you. It's very difficult to figure out. If you're on the low side, your adaptation strategy could be throwing on your waders and your raincoat. But if you're at that high level of sea level rise, you're needing to put your deep sea diving suit on. So adaptation, given the range of projections for sea level rise, is really challenging for states and communities. So what we do at the center is really help communities figure out, once they've figured out what their vulnerabilities are and what their risks are, helping them walk through what their options are to adapt to those changes in their physical environment. And in the coastal context, you're really looking at 3 different strategies. You can accommodate by building things higher to better withstand flooding. That's your typical house on stilts approach if you've ever been to the Outer Banks in North Carolina. You can protect by building a seawall, and there are environmental trade-offs that come with that. And you can retreat by relocating and moving structures out of harm's way. Many states and localities across the country are already starting to plan for these impacts. We have now 15 states that have comprehensive statewide adaptation plans that look across their sectors and the range of impacts that they're likely to see. And then you have a host of other localities that are also developing local adaptation plans or incorporating climate change into existing planning documents at the local level that drive local decision making. So let's talk first about what states are doing to prepare for impacts. At the Climate Center, we host a state implementation progress tracking tool, which you can find on our website, and I'll show you that later, that you can look and see, here in Pennsylvania, your state, or wherever you live, what is my state doing to prepare for climate change? For the states, those 15 states that have comprehensive statewide plans, we go goal by goal and assess whether or not the state is actually implementing the goal and catalog the progress they're making. to prepare for climate change. But if you're in one of those states that doesn't have a plan, there's still information about what the state is doing to prepare for climate impacts, what local governments are doing, what some of the regional entities. So there is information across every state about what activity, if anything, they're doing on climate preparedness. Some examples of what states are doing to implement their goals. In Maryland, they're leading by example. Their governor issued an executive order requiring that all state investments be designed and sited to withstand future sea level rise. So they have their co-smart construction guidelines that require, first, you site structures out of floodplains and out of harm's way, and second, you take that accommodation approach, elevate it, build it more to be more resilient to flood impacts. In San Francisco, the state agency there has passed new Bay Plan rules that require that developers that are building along the waterfront plan for future sea level rise and design projects to be able to withstand future sea level rise. And this is a project that's being proposed for Treasure Island, right in the middle of the bay. And it's a large-scale development project, so they're using all three of those strategies we talked about earlier. So they're using natural buffers to protect against flood impacts by dedicating open space along the shore's edge. They're elevating the lower density structures, and they're clustering the higher density development at the highest point of the island so that it's the most protected by the natural landscape of the island. And then to deal with that uncertainty about the rate and level of rise, they're also requiring the developer to put aside funds to build flood protection structures in the event that they're needed, in the event that sea levels rise higher than is anticipated in the initial design. At the local level, local governments are also doing a lot to prepare in many communities. The first step for a lot of communities is to incorporate considerations of climate impacts into local plans, like their hazard mitigation plans that govern how they respond to a disaster event and how they rebuild after a disaster event. Other communities are incorporating climate into their local comprehensive plans that govern how land use decisions are made on the ground. Another example comes from Boston, where as part of their zoning requirements, they have an adaptation checklist. So similar to what San Francisco is doing at the state level, Boston is doing at the local level, and they're not only just considering the impact of sea level rise, they're looking across the range of climate impacts. So developers have to look at how their building will withstand additional flooding, but also how their building will withstand increased temperatures. So this is Spalding Hospital, which was built before the rules were put in place, but demonstrates some of the building level changes you can make to a structure to make sure that it can withstand future climate change. So they elevated the critical equipment onto the roof so that you can maintain power in the event of a flooding event, elevating the entire structure to the 100-year floodplain and what that floodplain is going to look like in 2085. Making sure that windows are operable. So in the event of a power outage and there's no air conditioning, you can open those windows and get ventilation and people aren't stifling. And then they're incorporating green roofs to make sure that the building is insulated and that it's not contributing to urban heat island effect. The other part of this equation that a lot of communities are grappling with is the impact on these extreme events on low-income and the most vulnerable parts of our community, which I think was echoed in the Pope's encyclical. After Katrina, we saw huge displacement from these storm events and really disproportionate impacts on the most low-income parts of the community. And not only can the impacts have disproportionate effect, but also the adaptation response can often also be disproportionately directed at lower income segments of the community. For example, with retreat policies, we often target those buyouts to the most cost-effective housing to purchase. And so you're not only buying out those structures and displacing those communities, but also reducing the social community and cohesiveness of living within a community and the neighbors that folks rely on to take care of their kids when they need to go to the doctor or other types of situations. So we're working with a place called Chester, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia, locally, where they have, it's a very economically distressed community. They have a lot of blight, but they also have a lot of flood risk. They're right along the Delaware River. And so we're trying to help them figure out how they can deal with the blight situation, do some economic redevelopment, build new affordable housing in the upland parts of their community, and swap these new houses for some of the more repetitive flood loss properties they have within the community, and maintain that social cohesion, keep people in the community, and give them a safe, nice place to live. Some other options about how communities are preparing for sea level rise and the strategies they can use in land use and other legal frameworks you can explore in our sea level rise toolkit, which is also available on the internet. And then the other piece of this is the federal government, along with the Clean Power Plan and what the Obama administration is doing to help reduce emissions. There was also a parallel effort with federal agencies to have them think about their federal programs, policies, funds, and the ways they're administering those programs, and think about how they can help and change those programs to better help state and local governments prepare for impacts. We led a series of convenings with federal agencies and their state and local partners to look at a whole host of federal programs and come up with recommendations about how you use those existing programs to better support the adaptation efforts that state and local governments are already taking on the ground. And then the other resource that we offer is our Adaptation Clearinghouse. It's designed with state and local government users in mind, but it includes thousands of resources to help state and local governments think about what their vulnerabilities to climate change will be and how they prepare and respond to those future impacts. And that's my contact information and some websites to take a look at. Thank you so much.
Okay, up next we have Kelly Stevens from Syracuse University on organizational understanding of the U.S. EPA and unfinished business. And I'm sure unfinished business will be a title you can continue for a lifetime work for them. She's at the Maxwell School Center for Policy and Research, and she is a PhD candidate in public administration and international affairs with a background in meteorology. Her research interests are in environmental policy and also the management aspects of these things. And I'd like to welcome Kelly.
Okay. Thank you for having me here. The title of my talk is The Organizational Understanding of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Unfinished Business. And so what I'm going to be looking at is why the EPA, the U.S. agency responsible for environmental regulation, has had difficulty initiating rulemaking on climate change. And I'm going to draw upon organizational theory to help explain what are the aspects of the EPA that have made this difficult. So, like Mary Wood talked about this morning, this starts all the way back in the 1980s. So in 1987, the US EPA released a report called their Unfinished Business Report. And what this report did was rank 31 environmental problems according to risk, and they compared these rankings by the agency experts or career scientists, mid-level management, and staff to what the agency was actually doing, and also compared these rankings to public opinion. And interestingly, what they found was that there was a mismatch of priorities. So things that the agency experts thought were very important or high priority, such as climate change, were actually low priority according to the agency mission. And this is the EPA's agency mission. And also, it was mismatched to public opinion priority. So, and vice versa. Issues that the public thought were important were of high priority to the agency, but low priority to the agency experts. So what this is described in organizational theory literature is a problem with rational priority setting, where the agency experts are determining the agenda of the agency. So I'm going to talk about why EPA has this problem. So to better illustrate what the report does, I have 4 environmental problems listed here, and on the right I have how these environmental problems ranked according to the 4 assessment areas in the unfinished business report, and that's cancer, non-cancer, ecological, and welfare risk. And then I computed an average ranking to give you a better idea of how that ranks as a priority to the agency experts. And when you look at global warming, you see it was a high priority to the agency experts, but about a mid-level priority to the public. And then oppositely, issues such as hazardous waste sites were ranked as a high priority to the public and to the agency, but a low or medium level priority to the agency experts, or again, the career scientists and staff members there. So today we do hear that EPA is taking efforts to initiate rulemaking on climate change. And so I have a timeline of what their efforts are, and starting back in 1987 with this unfinished business report. And we see there was a long time period when EPA did not initiate rulemaking on climate change. And instead, after a Supreme Court decision, Massachusetts versus EPA, with states et al., sued EPA to do something about climate change, do we start seeing that EPA started initiating rulemaking, such as the tailpipe rule, the tailoring rule, and so on and so forth. And then we're going to hear next about EPA's Clean Power Plan, recently released in 2015. So these are rulemaking that EPA started after external forces forced their hand. So again, my research question here is, what are the organizational aspects of the EPA that have contributed to their difficulty with rational priority setting, which particularly affects their ability to address emerging environmental issues such as climate change? And the 3 streams of literature I'm going to look at in organizational theory are principal-agent theory, institutionalism, and systems theory, and I'll describe those all next as I go on. So the first theory I'm looking at is principal-agent theory, which generally describes a contractual relationship between a buyer and a seller. And so in org theory, this has been applied to describe the relationship between the bureaucracy, or in this case, the agency experts, and the political environment. And literature often looks at the amount of control that the principal has over the agent. So this is very grossly simplified, but I'm showing this relationship between the principals here, in this case, goes down from public, and I'm focusing a lot on Congress's relationship, all the way down to the EPA experts, so the agency experts. So I say it's grossly simplified because it's political environment is more complex than this, but this is how I'm going to look at it. So what we see at the EPA is that there's high control and monitoring of the agency by the principal, and in this case I'm talking about Congress. And intuitively, this decreases the amount of discretion that the agency experts have to set their own agenda about what they're addressing. And we see this at the EPA, and Mary Wood talked about this morning too, is their authority stems from outdated, limited statutes. So like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, this increases the amount of control over the agency. Anything that the EPA does, any objective that they have for their agenda, has to be related to a specific statutory authority. So for an example on the right, I have one of their objectives in their 1997 strategic plan for clean water, and they have to show exactly how what they're trying to do relates back to specific statutes. So the reason why there's a high control relationship between Congress and EPA is, well, there's several reasons, but on the left here I show there's high distrust of the agency. And according to organizational theory literature, we see the reasons why this is happening. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is goal conflict. When you think about what the EPA is trying to do, it butts up against many other interests of Congress, such as the economy, jobs, industry. So there's this inherent goal conflict that the EPA is continually dealing with. So that creates a situation of high distrust of the agency, which can increase control over the agency. Also, EPA has to answer to multiple principles. So I showed a very simplified schematic of the relationship earlier, but really they also have to answer to the White House, they have to answer to federal courts, the scientific community, the public. So this situation where they have multiple principles and they're answering to many people can also lead to an increase in control over the agency. And further, we've heard many members of Congress say, I'm not a scientist. There's this problem of information asymmetry, where the scientists or the EPA agency experts have more knowledge and more information about the situation that they're dealing with. And so this can also lead to high distrust of the agency by Congress. And last, there's difficulty measuring EPA's performance. Many of the things the EPA is doing now is meant to make improvements later. So there's this time span, a lag in when you're seeing the enhancement of environmental performance. And it's also difficult just to measure what is the value of a human life, what is the value of an improved watershed. So there's this difficulty measuring performance, which can lead to this tendency for more behavior-based contracts, which measure things like how many permits are issued. And so they're just not measured well in terms of environmental performance. So the next stream of literature and organizational theory I'm going to talk about is institutionalism. So again, this is also a bit intuitive. Institutionalism is the organizational inertia of an organization, so concretized rules and norms. So as you can imagine, the more institutionalism you have in an agency, the more difficulty the agency is going to have to change or to practice rational priority setting and address emerging environmental issues. So we see that there's high institutionalism at EPA, and the reason why is because they are constantly subjected to political pressures and resource limitations. They're constantly under the threat of being dissolved by some members of Congress, and they continually face shrinking budgets. And when you think about it, it's difficult to take on a new agenda item if you have a limited budget or a shrinking budget. And it's also difficult to come up with a new agenda item when you're under threat constantly of even staying intact. So this has created high institutionalism at the EPA, which makes it homogenized. It's the same every year. They don't evolve. They don't change. Their change agenda is more difficult to implement. And so the agency has become more oriented around rule compliance rather than addressing emerging environmental risks. The last system I'm going to talk about is systems theory, and this focuses on the roles and structure of a hierarchy. So the features in the EPA system that have made it more difficult for them to practice rational priority setting and set their own agenda is, the first one I'm going to talk about is fragmentation. So we've heard a little bit about it today. The implementation of EPA regulations typically happens at the state and local level. And this is not necessarily a problem. However, it does make it more difficult for the agency to build steam towards one new agenda item or to work together, because there's this fragmentation happening in how implementation takes place. And we heard about this morning from Mary Wood. The agency is organized by product or by media. So for example, there are offices of air and radiation, solid waste and emergency response, and water at the EPA. And what would actually make it more easy for the EPA to work together is if it was divided by function instead. So I borrowed these examples of a functional organization from the National Academy of Public Administration report in 1995. They could instead have offices of building scientific understanding of risk, setting standards and writing regulations. So now it's more about what the agency is trying to do rather than siloed approach by media. And again, it is organized that way, largely because of the statutory authorities that it operates under. That's the way they're written. And this is particularly important for climate change and emerging issues that are more complex than the issues that they used to address, or that when the Clean Air Act was written that we knew about. So climate change involves many different medias and it requires many different approaches to address. So to break that up a little bit would help allow the agency to better address these issues. So now to end on a more positive note, what are some solutions to these problems that the EPA is having? So again, according to principal agent theory, there's this issue of high control over the agency. So what the agency could do, or what they could use directly, is increase authorities. Have more cross-media or integrated statutes. This requires a lot of change, but this would allow the agency to address these complex issues more integrated. Or possibly elevate the EPA to a cabinet-level status. We're one of the only developed nations that does not have an environmental representation at the cabinet-level status. Indirectly, improve trust of the EPA through improved measurement. Perhaps develop an independent Bureau of Environmental Statistics, which would allow for better measurement and better performance reporting of the EPA. The issue, according to institutionalism, was it's slow to change. And one of the suggestions floated for this, coming from Dietz, Ostrom, and Stern, which can be a little bit controversial, is a more smaller scale adaptive management approach. And so it's now, the system is not so large, it's not so homogenized, and now it can be more able to change and address new issues as they come up. And last, the issue with systems theory was it's not integrated. We have that implementation arm at the state and local level, perhaps improve collaboration between the federal and the state and local levels, or organized by function, which has been called upon since the 1990s, this need to change how it's organized and have more cross-media approach. So my parting thoughts here is there may be an application to other agencies as well to enhance rational priority setting from what we've learned by looking at the EPA. And by restructuring it, we may be better able to address emerging environmental issues such as climate change in a better way, and which would allow us to potentially improve overall strategic planning at the agency or various agencies and lead to a better use of limited resources. Because, like I said, they're facing a shrinking budget year after year, and many agencies are. So that is my talk, and thank you for having me.
All right, thank you, Kelly. I really like the competing models approach to the explanation, that type of an approach to understanding what's happening. Our next speaker is going to be Hillary Cox, a Duquesne University graduate student, who is presenting on the EPA's Clean Power Plan and its impacts on southern Pennsylvania. She currently is a judicial intern for the Honorable Joy Flowers Conti, Chief Judge for Western District of Pennsylvania, a research assistant for Professor Jane Levine, an executive research editor for the Duquesne University, Duquesne Energy and Environmental Law Journal. I'd like to welcome to the podium Hillary Cox.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Hillary Cox, and I'm in my third year at Duquesne University School of Law. Before I get started, I would just like to acknowledge my Professor Jan Levine. He was very influential to the writing of my paper, and I'd also like to thank Emily Biddle. She was my team leader for Duquesne University's Law Review. So today I'd like to talk to you about the EPA's Clean Power Plan. I'm very happy to be following Kelly. She had a great presentation on the EPA structure and the Clean Power Plan is a proposal under the Clean Air Act section. Its goal is to continue lowering the carbon intensity emissions that result from power generation in the United States. A national lower carbon intensity inherently will require fewer emissions of carbon dioxide, one of the main greenhouse gases that the EPA considers to be the cause of climate change and global warming. So the plan proposes state-specific goals for cutting the carbon emissions that originate from the power sector, and it provides for guidelines for each state to develop state-specific plans. In 2009, the EPA released a document called the Endangerment Finding, which undeniably shows that we need to impose plans that will reduce the emissions. The elevated greenhouse gases, they are expected to place large amounts of the country at risk of reduced water supplies, increased water pollution, floods, droughts, heat-related illness, and the plan will curtail these adverse impacts from carbon dioxide that the power sector has on agriculture, our ecosystems, and forest productivity. The National Research Council of National Academics noted that absent a reduction in emissions, concentrations of carbon dioxide by the end of the century would increase to levels that the Earth has not experienced for millions of years. The need for this plan is undeniable. So what it calls for is nationwide by 2030, we would achieve CO2 emission reductions from the power sector of approximately 30%. So this is achievable because innovations in the production, distribution, and use of electricity are already making the power sector more efficient and sustainable. However, we have a lot of work to do still. The EPA predicts that in 2030, the reduced amount of carbon dioxide pollution will result in a total of $55 to $93 billion in net climate and health benefits. The proposal also emphasizes the flexible nature of the guidelines. From state to state, there's going to be different needs, and the rule will still allow states to continue to rely on a diverse set of energy resources, so that to ensure that the electric system is reliable and provide affordable electric to each state. So just some of the different components of the state plan include the identification of entities affected by the proposal, a description of the plan's approach and its geographic scope, a demonstration that the proposed plan is believed to be capable of achieving emission performance level, identification of emission standards, identification of milestones to keep the states in check on their progress towards the plan, and certification of a hearing on the state plan, among other components. So many of you, if you're from Pennsylvania, you know that coal is an integral element of the state's economy. The Clean Power Plan's call for a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions will undoubtedly impact Pennsylvania's coal industry. Southwestern Pennsylvania has historically been a national leader in coal production, and the major coal seam in Pennsylvania is a part of the Appalachian Mountain Range, which extends as far south as Alabama and starts in northeastern PA. Pennsylvania led the nation in the production of coal between 1880 and 1930, and in 1925, Pennsylvania's coal contributions made up over a third of the nation's total coal production. Today, coal mining does remain an integral part of our economy here in Pennsylvania, as evidenced by a study conducted by Pennsylvania Economy League of Greater Pittsburgh. The coal industry generates more than 41,500 jobs in Pennsylvania. That approximately $3.1 billion of Pennsylvania's economic output stems directly from it. The study notes that coal is responsible for 54% of Pennsylvania's electricity, making it the #1 source of electricity in our state. Furthermore, the vitality of the transportation sector in Pennsylvania relies heavily on the coal industry. In a survey conducted by the United States Department of Transportation in 2007, coal constituted 69% of the total tons of freight transported by rail in Pennsylvania. And the Port of Pittsburgh, which notably is the second largest river port in the United States, handles 34 million tons of goods each year, with coal constituting approximately 76% of the goods that come through the port. So last summer, I was on my way to work for Judge Conti, and I was met by protesters, which they inspired me to write this paper. There were many people who were both in favor of the imposition of the Clean Power Plan and who were against the Clean Power Plan, protesting outside of the building where the EPA held these hearings. The hearings were held in 4 cities across the country, and Pittsburgh, being a city that does rely heavily on the coal industry, was lucky enough to have the hearings come here. So the hearings in Pittsburgh were held July 31st and August 1st in 2014. And like I said, they're just down the road. So thousands of coal miners marched the streets around the William S. Moorhead Federal Building, brandishing signs and chanting, "Hey, hey, EPA, don't take our jobs away." And the environmentalists were there as well, reminding them that without the planet, there are no jobs. Speakers at the Pittsburgh hearings hailed from environmentalist groups like the Sierra Club and Moms Clean Air Force, as well as industry groups like International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers and the United Coal Mine Workers of America. I propose that a thorough examination of the testimony collected from the hearings will show the serious issues posed to Pennsylvania as a state by the potential adoption of the proposed rule, as well as the implications that threaten the livelihood and well-being of mankind if changes are not made to the current energy production of the industry. At this point, I'd like to pose a question to the group as a whole. You don't have to raise your hand or anything, but I just want everyone to think about whether it was you or someone you know who lost a job. It's a really scary feeling, and the Clean Power Plan and the reductions are undeniably needed by our country, but they're going to adversely affect others as well. And I just think that the heart of this conference, the integrity of creation, really it calls us to take responsibility for those who are going to be harmed by this plan as well. So I just want to consider both sides of my presentation. So plans for assisting workers in the coal and power sector are necessary if this Clean Power Plan will be successful in Southwestern Pennsylvania. Some of the potential problems facing the workers in the energy sector could be remedied if the EPA were to require the states to develop initiatives for assisting those who could lose their job as a direct result of the Clean Power Plan. I took a lot of testimonial statements from the transcripts that the EPA provided, and I think they are really telling, and I just wanted to share some of the statements with you all today. So Jennifer Garrison, a former state representative from Ohio and a Democratic candidate for Congress, voiced her concern about those who stood to lose their jobs, and she talked about how coal is reliable and abundant, and it's a source of energy that we can rely on. She noted that the families in my part of Ohio rely upon these jobs. Mine workers, utility workers, boiler makers, all of these individuals rely on these jobs, and they will be placed at risk if these regulations are allowed to be implemented. Janine Zappa, the executive director of Conservation from Consultants, a Pittsburgh-based nonprofit organization, also advocated similarly for responsible energy usage as well as responsible consideration of those working in the sector of energy. She noted that we would ask the EPA equally give consideration to requiring that the shift in some way prioritize job retraining and job replacement for those who would be most deeply impacted by these changes. Jonathan Robertson, an attorney from the Pittsburgh area, testified similarly, noting that we must work with the United Mine Workers in making sure the workers are protected economically, and that any jobs that are lost because of essential environmental production must be replaced with good union jobs. And a lot of the workers were at the hearings to voice their feelings as well. They shared their sense of betrayal, evidencing the need for the government to assist with the job placement that will surely be required once these plans get into full swing. Union representatives Timothy Merriman and he's the vice president of the local union 1473, and a worker for American Energy testified, "I cannot believe that my own government would eliminate my job. This governmental engineering sounds like something that would happen in a third world country or by communist regimes and not the United States of America." So there was a lot of very opinionated and very emotional testimony that went on. Brad Marshall, a resident of Washington County in Pennsylvania and a member of the Mine Workers Association, acknowledged the research and science behind the climate changes, but stated that everyone has an obligation to make sure that people have every chance at a healthy and prosperous life. A miner named Merriman similarly testified and said, "I do realize there are those who will argue that this policy will create jobs. I think some of them actually believe it. These are the same problems as we heard when electronics industries, plastic manufacturers, and even toy manufacturers flood the country." So we'll get to some of the testimony later about the creation of jobs. There was a lot of testimony and concern about the Clean Power Plan and the power grid. Many of the speakers at the public hearings raised concerns regarding the future of the nation's energy grid if the plan were to be enforced. As Jennifer Garrison reminded everyone, coal still accounts for nearly 40% of the power generated in the country, and it is extremely reliable. Private companies like NERA Economic Consulting have conducted studies assessing the nation's energy market and estimate the impact of the Clean Power Plan, what it will have on the market if the plan stands as it is today. NERA's study, titled NERA's Analysis of the Clean Power Plan, estimates that compliance costs will total between $366 and $479 billion between the years of 2017 and 2031, and that the annual compliance with the regulation could cost between $41 and $73 billion. The study estimates that double-digit electricity rate increases may be seen in up to 43 states, and 14 could see electricity rates increasing up to 20%. Philip Moeller, a member of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, warned that the regulation could potentially lead to widespread rotating blackouts in certain regions. However, many of the people who came to the EPA's public hearings were in support of the plan and had only positive things to point out, which I'd like to share with you all, because the plan is undeniably needed and there are a lot of benefits that we stand to reap from it. Many supporters of the Clean Power Plan point to the government's estimates regarding the potential health improvements that the nation stands to gain as a whole, such as the avoidance of 2,700 to 6,600 premature deaths, as well as the prevention of between 140,000 and 150,000 asthma attacks in children. Gretchen Dahlkemper, the national field manager of Moms Clean Air Force, called for an even more stringent standard to be adopted by the Clean Power Plan. She said that many moms like me, we don't think that the Clean Power Plan goes far enough, and she calls for the EPA to increase the carbon emissions to be cut by 40% by the year 2020. And Jennifer McIntyre, the field manager of Moms Clean Air Force, advocated for the plan that she believes will help her daughter's asthma. She noted at the hearing that nothing I've ever experienced comes close to the terror of watching an infant struggle to breathe. Children should not have to be rushed to the ER for nebulizer treatments just because corporations can't act responsibly. McIntyre described how the climate conditions in Philadelphia were less than ideal for asthmatics, and stated that in the previous year, Philadelphia experienced 50 orange ozone days, that the Philadelphia County received an F grade in both ozone pollution and particulate pollution. Some of the individuals who testified at the public hearings went so far as to argue that the Clean Power Plan will not have an adverse effect on the coal and energy industries, and work as most people believe. Stephanie Blinko, a self-proclaimed fractivist from Illinois, she came to testify in Pittsburgh and advocated and informed people that the Clean Power Plan sets modest and achievable standards that should be increased, and that the Clean Power Plan's carbon reduction goals will stimulate the energy market. She stated, "The good news is that renewable energy and energy efficiency investments create far more jobs per dollar than fossil fuels. Specifically, clean energy investment generates more than 3 times the number of jobs compared to the fossil fuel sector." Annette Schimmer, the president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Pittsburgh, expressed that the League looks forward to the economic impact of innovation and investment in new clean energy technologies that will create a new generation of clean energy jobs. Jackson Morris, the director of Eastern Energy of the Natural Resources Defense Council, testified that the proposed plan will also yield other significant benefits for us here in the Keystone State. Modeling shows that pursuing carbon reductions through a state plan that ramps up our investments in energy efficiency and renewable energy can yield more than 5,000 jobs by 2020 and save families and businesses over $450 million in energy costs. If life as we know it is to continue here on Earth, we need to implement the Clean Power Plan and cut back on carbon emissions. The projected and desired results of the power plan are not just about simply lowering the average temperatures. The Clean Power Plan stands to preserve and improve the health and wellness of the globe by squarely addressing climate change. The Clean Power Plan and the lessening of carbon emissions will certainly result in improved health for some, but for others, unfortunately, the implementation has the potential to adversely affect their life if additional steps are not taken in this plan. The health and welfare of those working in the coal and mining industry will be directly affected by the regulations promulgated by this act, and that the elimination of their jobs inherently eliminates the health insurance and potential pensions they stand to earn. Power companies have been bracing for the regulation and have already begun to shut down coal-fired power plants. Consol Energy, the second largest coal producer in the Central Appalachian area, will have to find alternative buyers for over 10 million tons of coal that they previously shipped to retired or soon-to-be retired plants. Mining companies and electrical power plants and utility companies have used force majeure clauses to do business for decades. These clauses have been successful in protecting power plants from having to take delivery of coal they no longer need if the plant is prevented from running by some new environmental regulation or another unforeseen circumstance. While many individuals outside the coal industry believe that the Clean Power Plan has the potential to spur the economy and provide for new jobs in the fossil fuels industry, those who stand to lose their job in the coal mining industry are doubtful, and I believe that steps in the plan that would assure them would be very beneficial for everyone. If the uncertainty that the plan imposes upon workers within the coal mining industry were to be eliminated, I think this regulation would truly be beneficial for all. And in conclusion, the adoption of the Clean Power Plan undeniably raises serious concerns with respect to the coal industry of Southwestern Pennsylvania, because coal plays a serious role in our economy in this part of the country, and a federal regulation that calls for the reduction of its use has serious implications on the livelihood of not only the miners, but all citizens of Southwestern Pennsylvania. The implications that the plan will have on this economy as a whole cannot be ignored, and that's why each state should be required to submit an in-depth description of its strategy for helping displaced employees find an alternative way to make a living with the imposition of this undeniably necessary plan. This is my work cited. Thank you all for listening, and thank you for having me today.
As moderator of the session, my task was to keep us on time, and I think we're at the end of our time, unfortunately, so I would welcome the opportunity for you to come up to, or even in the other room, each of the presenters today and have your questions be answered by them directly instead of trying to take one or maybe two questions and not doing any justice to that whole process. So thank you to the audience for your attendance today, to our speakers, Jessica, Kelly, and Hillary. Thank you so much for the information and that insight today. I welcome you to again engage and continue the conversation as we take, I think, a break, move into the other room, and have a larger discourse at that space and that time. Thank you again.